DAF Pei Dalet Amid Aleph Tanu Rabbanan Hareze Gitech Al Minas Shetinasi Ilaploni Harezu Lo Sinase V'imnise Lo Seitze. So the Mishnah, the Brisa gives an interesting case. A man says to a woman, "You're only divorced on the condition that you marry this specific Ploni guy. If you marry Ploni, then the get will be a get." So the Brisa says she cannot marry, but if she does marry, she does not leave. In other words, b'di'evet, the marriage is a marriage. So the Gemara's question is, this is clearly ambiguous. My kamar, what does that Brisa mean? Like when it says she cannot marry, is she cannot marry that guy? She cannot marry anyone? What does it mean? So Amar Rav Nachman Hachi Kamar. Rav Nachman says this is the meaning of the Brisa. Harezu lo sinase lo shema yomru nishein nosim b'matana. She can't marry the Ploni that the husband has specified. That's the guy she cannot marry, because if she marries him, people are going to think that wife swapping is permitted in Judaism. Okay, here, I'm giving my wife over to my friend. I just read last night there was a famous case among two baseball players that swapped wives. I saw it on social media last night. Famous case. I don't know. But you know what I'm talking? I don't know. Anyway, the point is that no one should think that in Judaism we permit this. It creates a societal breakdown. But v'im niseis la'acher lo seitze. And if she marries another guy, b'di'evet, she can stay married to another guy. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Umishum gezera lo mafkinan minei v'sharinan eishes ish la'alma? I don't understand, says the Gemara. Just because you're not going to let her marry the Ploni that was specified by the husband, you're going to allow her to marry somebody else? The husband's conditional statement is a valid conditional statement. If you recall, the only time that the Mishnah had said that it's not a valid get is if the husband says, this is your get, chutz mi Ploni, except for so-and-so. But if you say almanas on the condition, a conditional requirement in the get is a completely valid condition. So she's still a married woman if she's not marrying Ploni. So then how can she go ahead and marry somebody else and stay legally married to him? If you're telling me that b'di'evet, if she marries another guy, she's allowed to stay married, how can that be? So Ella Amar of Nachman Hachika Amar. Harezu lo sinase lo shema yomru nishem nostim b'matana v'imnises lo seitze demishum gezera lo mafkinan. Rather, says Rav Nachman, it means she cannot marry that Ploni, because people shouldn't say that we allow wife swapping in Judaism. And if she does marry him b'di'evet, then she's fulfilled the Tanai, she's legally divorced, and we let her stay married, because it's only a rabbinic concern about societal breakdown, and therefore, if b'di'evet she marries him, we'll let her stay married. So Amar le Rava, lohu de lo sinase hala'achar tinasi v'habaya kiyumi l'tana. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, what are you suggesting? That she's only not allowed to marry the Ploni guy, but she could marry anybody else? But if she marries anybody else, she hasn't fulfilled the Tanai, so she's still a married woman. How can that be? Maybe you'll argue like this. Maybe it's okay for her to marry Yankel, right, who was not part of the Tanai. The husband just said, don't marry Ploni. So she says, okay, fine, I'll marry Yankel. So he says, you need to marry Ploni. And she says, well, the rabbis told me I can't marry Ploni because it looks like wife swapping. So I'll marry Yankel instead, but then she's not divorced. So the Gemara says, well, maybe you'll tell me that she'll marry Yankel and eventually she'll make her way to Ploni and fulfill the Tanai. Maybe you'll compare this to the Man Omar who argues with Rav Yehuda. What's the machlokes? The itmar konam enai b'shina hayomi mishan lamachar. The Gemara Nedarim has the following discussion. What if a person takes a neder? He says, I hereby forbid my eyes from sleep. In other words, I hereby take a vow that I'm not going to sleep today if I sleep tomorrow. So if I sleep tomorrow, I cannot sleep today. But by inference, if I don't sleep tomorrow, I can sleep today. So the shaila is like this. Is he allowed to sleep today, al pi halacha, or not? So it's a conditional vow. So Amar Rav Yehuda, al yishan hayom shema yishan l'machar. So Rav Yehuda says, no, you can't sleep today because maybe you'll sleep tomorrow, and then if you sleep today, you'll be in violation of your neder. But for Rav Nachman, Amar yishan hayom vein choshishin shema yishan l'machar. But Rav Nachman disagrees, and maybe we're going like Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, go ahead, you could sleep today, You'll just make sure that you don't sleep tomorrow. And so maybe you want to say the same thing. Even though the husband says you're only divorced if you marry Ploni, and you can't therefore marry anybody else, but she'll say to herself, you know what? I'll marry Yankel, and then something will happen. Yankel will either divorce me, or he'll die, or whatever, and then eventually I'll make my way over to Ploni and marry Ploni, so then the get will have retroactively been a good get. So what's the problem, right? So the Gemara says, but how can you make that analogy? Hachi hashta hasam b'didei kayama di boy mavriz navshe b'siluasa v'lo noim. Hacha b'dida kayama li'igrushe? Question mark. The Gemara says, come on, that's not analogous to what Rav Nachman was talking about over there. He was there talking about a situation where the person who's taking the neder is completely in control of the situation. If I sleep today, I could take pins and needles and stick it in myself and stand up the whole time and put cold ice water over myself to make sure that I don't sleep. I can control the situation. But if a woman says like this, you know what, I'll marry Yankel and eventually I'll make my way over to Ploni, she's not in control of that situation. If she marries Yankel, she can't decide when she's going to get divorced to eventually allow herself to marry Ploni. So therefore, since she's not in control of the situation, we don't allow her to do that. So how could you tell me that she is allowed to marry another guy? So Elo Amar Rava Harezu Lo Sinase Lo Harezu Lo Sinase Lo Velo La'acher. Therefore, what really the Brisa means is she can't remarry at all. She can't marry anyone, neither the Ploni guy that the husband requires her to marry in order for the get to be a get, nor can she marry anyone else. Lo sinase shema yarmanishose nosnim b'matana. She can't marry Ploni because people will say that there's wife swapping in Judaism. La'acher lo sinase. Thank you so much. She can't marry anyone else. Debaya kiyumi l'tana, because she needs to fulfill her tanai. V'im niseis lo seitze. But if she marries Ploni, the guy who her husband required her to marry, even though we said midrabanan she shouldn't marry him, if b'di'evet she does, she could stay married to him. The mishum gezerah lo mafkinan, because it's only a derabanan, we don't cause the breakup of the marriage. But la'acher teitze the ba'alakim l'tana. But if she married another guy, if she married Yankel, then Taka has to leave Yankel because she's still a married woman because she didn't fulfill the Tanai. Now Tanya Kavose de Rava, and we have a brisa that supports Rava's explanation, right? Which is like this: Harezu lo sinase lo lo v'lo la'acher v'imnises lo lo seitze la'acher teitze. She can't marry Ploni and she can't marry anybody else. She can't marry Ploni because people will say that there's wife swapping. But if she does b'di'evet, it's okay. She can stay married to him, and she can't marry anybody else. And if she does marry anybody else, since she's still technically a married woman, she has to leave that second husband. Okay, let us go weiter. Tanu Rabbana. Tanu Rabbana. Hareze gitech amanasha tali l'rakia, amanasha terdi l'tahom. Al-Menashe Tivli Kana Shel Dalet Amos. Al-Menashe Tavili Kana Ben Kuf Amma. Al-Menashe Tavri Yasayam Hagadol Biraglayim Eino Get. A man makes these outlandish conditions on the get. He says, this is your get on the condition that you go up to the sky. Now, today, that would be fulfillable, right? Just go on SpaceX or just even take an airplane and you're okay. But in the times of the Gemara, no one can fly, right? Or on the condition that you go down to the Tahom, which is the lowest depths of the subterraneous world. Al-Menashe Tivli Kanashal Dalas, on the condition that you swallow a bamboo that's 4 cubits long. That would be pretty impressive. I would pay to see that. Al-Menashe Tavili Kana Ben Kufama, on the condition that you bring me a stick that's 100 amas long, which is impossible to find. Al Menashe Tavri Yasayam Hagadol Biraglayich, on the condition that you walk over either the Mediterranean or the Atlantic with your feet. Yashka. Well, even Yashka couldn't walk that far, right? Right. So he says. So in all of those conditions, ain't no get. That's not a get, because basically he's essentially negating the effectiveness of the get by creating an impossible condition. But Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema Omer Kazeh get. But Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema says, no, that is a get. By creating an outlandish, an impossible condition, you're essentially saying gobbledygook. You're essentially saying something that's nonsensical, and therefore you mean the get to be a good get, and everything else that you say is just to be discarded. And notice that he says kazeh. This kind of situation is a get. Now, when you say this kind of situation is a get, usually that's an exclusionary clause, and we'll explain that in just a minute. And then klal omar Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema, and then he says a general rule, which means he's coming to include. So he's using an exclusive word, kazeh, and now he's using an inclusive word, which is klal. And that's going to be relevant in a moment. Kol tanai she'ef shelo lekaimo besofo v'hislav mitchilaso ena ela kemafliga b'dvarim b'kasher. Any kind of condition that is impossible to fulfill at the end, even if he makes that a stipulation up front, it's completely null and void, and all he's doing is trying to annoy her. And really, he means to give her the get without any conditions. And therefore the get is kosher. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rav Halacha Rav Yehuda ben Tema. So Rav Nachman, in the name of Rav, says that's taka the halacha. And Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Masnisa Nami Dika. We can infer this from a Mishnah or a Brisa in Maseches Bava Metzia, because the Ketani Kol She'ef Shelo Lekaimo B'Sofa V'Isnlov B'Tchilaso Tano Kayim. The Brisa over there in Bava Metzia says that if a person can fulfill the Tanai that he makes initially, then the Tanai is binding. But you can infer from that language, ha'ef shirtano batal shmamina. So we can infer from that language that if it's impossible to fulfill the Tanai is batal. Now we bayilahu. Now the question was raised. Hareze gitech almanasha tochli bisar chazir mahu. What if a man says to his wife, "This is your get on the condition that you eat pig meat, on the condition that you have bacon"? Is that valid, that Tanai, or not? So, either way, she's got to deal with a pig, right? That's what someone said this morning. Amar Abaye, he. Abaye said, he. He said, it's the same thing. In other words, he said, it's the same thing as Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema. So if you paskin like Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema, just like she can't fly, and just like she can't walk on water, she can't eat bacon, and therefore it's a get even without her eating the bacon.
But there are halachas, aren't there, where shasatzchak or for medical reasons, so you can't treif?
All right, interesting. You could create scenarios where she could eat, right? So the Gemara is apparently not reckoning with that. Apparently, maybe he's telling her within the next 5 minutes you've got to eat bacon, or have to have this plate of bacon. Rava Amar Efshir da'achla v'lakya. But Rava says, I disagree. Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema is only talking about things that are physically impossible to do. This is physically possible, but it's halachically forbidden. But if she eats the bacon, she'll get malchus, and she'll be divorced. So, le'abaya klal la'asuye bisar chazir, le'rava kazel le'mu'ute bisar chazir. So it turns out that Yehuda ben Tema made an exclusionary statement and an inclusionary statement. He said kazeh and he said klal. So according to Abaye, the reason why he said klal to be inclusive is to include that even if it's halachically forbidden, it's no different from something that's physically impossible. But according to Rava, he said kazeh to exclude something that's physically possible but halachically impossible, like the case of eating bacon. So let's ask a challenge now. Hareza gitech almanasha tivoali leploni niskaim hatanai hareza get vim laveno get. The first part of the brisa says a man says to his wife, "This is your get on the condition that you have intimacy with so and so." Now he's not telling her to do something that's usher, right? Because theoretically she could marry the guy and have permissible relations with him. So that is a binding condition, and if she ends up having relations with that ploni, then she's divorced, and if not, she's not divorced. Next case, almanah shelo tivoli la'aba ula avich ein choshesh shema nival alohen. The next case of the Bryce is a man says, "This is your divorce on the condition that you're not intimate with my father or your father," which seems very strange. But the point is that the Bryce says it's a kosher get, and we don't even have to suspect that maybe she's had relations with someone who's an erva to her. The ilu almanasha tivoli la'aba lavich lo katani. Notice that the Brysa omits the obvious third case, which is this is your get on the condition that you have relations with either my father or your father, which is halachically prohibited, right? So what do you see from there? La Abaye nicha la Rav Akasha. According to Abaye, it works out well why the Brisa doesn't say that, because that's not a binding condition. That's like saying on the condition that you walk on water. But according to Rava, why doesn't the Brisa address that? So Amar Lecha Rava Bishlam Bisar Chazir Efshir Da'achla Velakya Ploni Nami Efshir Demeshachta Le B'Mamona Ela Abba V'Avich B'Dida Kaima Nihi Di'ihi Avda Isura Abba V'Avich Mi Avda Isura. So the Rava says, no, in that case I agree with you, Abaye. There, it's also considered to be like physically impossible for her to do. Because, look, in a situation where it's up to her to either eat the bacon or not, it's completely within her control whether she's going to decide to do something that's usher. So that's not what Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema was talking about. That's a binding condition. The other case of the Brisa where he says you have to have intimacy with Ploni, where you're allowed to marry Ploni, she could pay him $100,000 and says, listen, either marry me, spend the night with me, do whatever you need to do, and there's no halachic prohibition, right? If she has intimacy, they can do it in a halachically permitted way. So there's no inaccessibility to her fulfilling the Tanai, and that's why the Tanai is binding in those two cases. But in the case where he says to her, you need to have relations with someone who's in erva with you, she might be willing to do it, but how's she going to convince the other person to violate the halacha? No matter how much money she's going to offer, that person may turn her down because he doesn't want to violate halacha. So therefore, the Rava says that also is considered to be like physically impossible, like Yehuda ben Tema was saying, and therefore it's a nonsensical Tanai, and therefore she's divorced even without fulfilling the Tanai. And therefore the Gemara says, L'Rava klala asuye abba va'avich, and therefore, according to Rava, when Yehuda ben Tema used the inclusionary word klal, he means to say not only when she has to walk on water is it not a tanai, but even if the condition is just to have relations with an erva, and kazeh l'mu'ute b'sar chazir, and according to Rava, the word kazeh that Yehuda ben Tema used, which is an exclusionary word, is to exclude when he says you have to eat bacon, because there the tanai is binding, and la'abaye klal asuye b'sar chazir and kazeh l'mu'ute ploni. And according to Abaye, the word klal is to tell me that even if he tells you got to eat bacon, the tanai is null and void, and she's divorced no matter what. And kazeh, which is to exclude, is talking about a case of where he says on the condition you have relations with ploni, that is a binding tanai because there's no violation of halacha. Shlomo,
relations with ploni is permitted because it's lemafreya. Gets lemafreya.
Right. It'll be activated. The get will be activated lemafreya, so that she will turn out that she was never married at that time. Okay. Now Meisve. Let's go on to the next. Raizel gitech amanashe tochli b'sar chazir. The Brisa says he gives her a get on the condition that she eats bacon. B'mhaisa zar amanashe tochli b'truma b'mhaisa nazir amanashe tishte yayin. Or he goes to her if she's not a bas kohen, and he says on the condition, this is your get on condition that you eat truma, which is just as treif as chazer. Or if he says if she's a nazir, he says to her on the condition that you drink wine. In all of those cases, and someone asked also, Rabbi Black, a nazir can get a hataras nadarim, right? So obviously you have to say that there's a situation that we're dealing with where he says this, you have to drink this glass of wine in the next 5 minutes or whatever. So otherwise, it's going to be difficult, this Gemara. But in any event, the Brisa says niskayim hatanai harei get v'im lav eino get. If the tanai is fulfilled, in other words, the tanai is binding, then it's a valid get. But if the tanai is not fulfilled, it's not a valid get. She doesn't eat the bacon, it's not a valid get. So Rava nichal Abaye kasha. This Brisa supports Rava, who says that this is not like Yehuda ben Tema's halacha. This is a binding tanai. But Abaye is going to have a problem with this. So Amar L'cha Abaye, mi sabris divrei akolhi, hamani rabbanani. Abaye says, what's the kasha? I'm only going according to Yehuda ben Tema. Yehuda ben Tema argues with the Chachamim. The Brisa that you're citing goes according to the Chachamim, so it works out very well. So now the Gemara says, "V'teipuklei demasl mashakasa b'torahu v'chol amasl mashakasa b'torah to no batal." So the Gemara says, "But Rava, still, I don't understand. You're saying that it's a binding tanai that if a man says this is your divorce on the condition that you eat bacon, we have a general klal in kol Torah kula that anytime you try to make a condition on something that's explicit in the Torah to contravene something that's explicit in the Torah, that attempt is completely batal, is completely null and void. So how come you're upholding it over here?" So the Gemara says, "Amar Rav Ada Berei de Rav Ika ki amrinan masl mashakasa b'torah tano batal kagon she'era ksusa ve'onasa jehu ka'akar aval ahacha ihi ka'akra." So Rav Ada tries to offer the following distinction in Svara. He says, when do we say that a maslam ashakasa b'Torah, the Tanai is null and void, is when the person who is trying to create the transaction or the new situation is making a contingent upon his violation of a Torah law. But if it's contingent upon her violation of the Torah law and not his violation, so then the Tanai is valid. In other words, the classic example of Maslam Ashakasa b'Torah is a man presents a woman with Kiddushin, and he says, this is valid marriage on the condition that I don't have to provide you with my marital duties, such as clothing and roof over your head and conjugal duties and so forth. So he's the one who's making the transaction, and he's the one who's saying that I have to violate the Torah in order for the transaction to work. That's where we say the Tanai is batal. But if I'm creating the transaction of the get, and you're the one that has to violate the Torah in order for it to work, there the Tanai is valid and binding. So the Gemara says, Maskef la Ravina klum ka'akra ihi ela l'kiyumi l'tanoi didei yishtakach di'ihu ka'akar. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute, if the only reason why she's going to eat the bacon is to fulfill his transaction, then he's the cause of the violation of the mitzvah, and in the final analysis, he's the one who's being mastel mashakasa b'Torah. He's creating this condition that causes a violation of the Torah. So we should say that the transaction is completely null and void. We should say that it's not a valid kiddushin, and we should say it's a totally invalid get. We should just obliterate the whole thing. So the Gemara then therefore says, Ela Omer Ravina Kamrinan Masal Mashakasu B'Torah. I'm sorry, not that they shouldn't be married, but we should say that they're married, like the Gemara says over there, but that the Tanai is null and void. And here too, according to you, Rava, we should go like Yehuda ben Tema. We should say that the get is a valid get, and the Tanai is completely an invalid Tanai. So Ela Omer Ravina Ki Amrinan Masal Mashakasu B'Torah Tano Batal Kagon She'erik Susa Ve'onasa Devadai Ka'akar. So the Gemara answers in the final analysis like this. The distinction is that in order for the husband wants the transaction to be fulfilled because he's the one who's initiating the get. And in the same thing, the husband wants the Tanai to be fulfilled because he's initiating the marriage. And he says, I want to be married to you, but I don't want to have to provide She'er Ksus and Ona. So there's an inherent contradiction there. He wants the marriage to be a marriage, but he wants to withhold his marital obligations. So there we say that since you want the marriage to go forward, we consider the stipulation of not holding to your marital obligations to be null and void, because you're trying to create a biblical situation by contravening the Bible. So therefore we say that your contravention is null and void, but the marriage is binding. But when it comes to a get, the reason why we will uphold the condition and consider you not divorced unless you eat the bacon is because the husband is saying, look, it's true that I'm initiating the get, but I'm not requiring, it's not like I'm requiring the get to go through. You've asked me for a divorce, I'm willing to give you a divorce, but this is what you have to do for me. In other words, he's asking for a quid pro quo from her. It's not like he's asking for, in the case of marriage, he's the one that's doing everything. Here, he's asking her for an exchange that she can choose to do or not to do. He says to her basically, if you want the divorce, this is what I require: eat bacon. I'm not forcing you to do it. If you don't want to eat bacon, so then don't eat the bacon, and you won't be divorced. That's the distinction between the case of marriage, where it's clearly indicated that he wants the marriage to take place, versus the get, where he's not demonstrating that he absolutely wants the get to go through. And therefore, if she chooses to not eat the bacon, so fine, she won't be divorced. And that's the way Rabbi looks at it. He looks at it as a binding condition, which basically he's trying to, in some way, afflict her, some way trying to cause her pain and suffering. But he says, you got to eat the bacon. If you don't want to eat the bacon, so then it's not a divorce.
Like another scenario could be is that his wife's not religious. And he says, you know what, if I see you catch her eating bacon again, the divorce is going to take effect. That would make perfect sense, right? Like that would seem to make a valid reason for divorce.
Interesting.
Yeah.
If you eat bacon again, no. If you eat bacon, this is a divorce.
In other words, he's not pleased with her.
He doesn't want her to eat the bacon. All right. But still, the halachic mechanism still is the same. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Now we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had taught us that if a man gives his wife, remember we talked about that case where he says, here, honey, this is the electric bill. And then she opens up the envelope and discovers a get. So the Mishnah had said that it's a valid get as long as he tells her, this is your get. If he doesn't say, this is your get, then it's not a valid get. But he has to say that. But we don't require, what did we say? We don't require in that case, when he tells her it's an electric bill, we don't require him to take it back from her and give it back to her. Actually, that's a machlokas Rabbi and Reb Shimon ben Elazar. That was a Mishnah that we learned two or three days ago. But the most previous Mishnah that we learned was the Mishnah where the husband said, this is your get, you're hereby divorced except from Ploni. In that situation, the Mishnah said, if you said that, it's not just enough for you to say, I was just kidding, you're divorced from everybody, but actually you have to take the get from her and then give it to her and say, you are hereby divorced from everyone. It's not enough for you to say after you've given it to her. So the Gemara, this causes the Gemara to infer, Mantana, Omer Chizki, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, he detana Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Omer, Ad sheyitlenu heimena v'yachso v'yitnenu la, v'yomer la he gitech. That this Mishnah seems to go like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, who said in that case where he gives her the electric, says it's the electric bill, that it's not enough to say after the fact that you've given it to her under false pretenses to say, I was just kidding, it's really a get. No, you have to physically take it from her, and while you're giving it to her, say, Raizel gitech. So our Mishnah seems to go like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, because according to Rabbi, you don't have to actually take it from her. If you told her it's the electric bill, put it in her hand, 5 minutes later you could say Raizel gitech and it's fine. So our Mishnah doesn't go like that, it goes like Reb Shimon ben Elazar. So the Gemara says no. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Afilu Tema Rabbi Dilchon Amar Shiny Hacha Hol Vikan Asu Li Pasel Bo Lekahuna. Rabbi Yochanan says no. I hold that this Mishnah would go even according to Rabbi, who says in that case of the electric bill, you don't have to take it back. Here, Rabbi would agree that you have to take it back in order to activate the get fully. Why? He says, because Dilchon, one of your rabbis from Bavel, namely Rav Kahana, who spent a lot of time studying Torah with Rabbi Yochanan, one of your guys, Rav Kahana, taught as follows. Rabbi would agree in a situation where there's a partial activation of the get, and you want to ramp up the partial activation to a full activation, there you have to take it from her and give it back to her. When there's no activation of the get at all when you give it to her because she thinks it's not a get at all, so then Rebbe says it's okay after the fact to say Raizel gitech to fully activate it. But if you gave it to her as a get, but it was a malformed tanai, saying that you're divorced from everyone except for Ploni, so because there's a partial activation of the get, in what sense? She now is no longer allowed to marry a Kohen, because she's now considered a gerusha. The only problem is that the get is not a valid get, so she can't marry anyone. So there, Rebbe would agree, since it was partially activated, you have to take it back from her and give it to her without that tanai, without that condition, and say Raizel gitech and Harayat muteres l'chol adam. You can marry any man that you want.
Because of reach of the get,
either because of reach a get or because she knows that it's a get. Yeah, it's not clear from the Gemara. We had said before that concept of reach a get, but yes, it sounds that way. Now, kasvo b'socho. The last thing that the Mishnah had said is the only time that you can take it back from her and give it to her is if there was no text in the get itself that says, that has that tanai of you're divorced chutz mi Ploni, except for Ploni. But if the text would be written in the get that you're divorced from everyone chutz mi Ploni, then even if you try to erase it, it's no good. You have to rewrite the entire get. Now, the Gemara now says, Omer Rav Safra, kaspo b'socho tanan. Rav Safra says, notice that the Mishnah says that it has to be written in the get in order for the get to be invalid. So the Gemara says, Pshita, kasva b'socho tanan. Rav Safra shkoyach, what are you telling me that I don't see with my own two eyes in the Mishnah? So the Gemara answers, Mahu detema hani mili la'achar hatoyref, avol lifnei hatoref al filu al pen nami pasul kamash malon. that Rav Safra is telling me the following chiddush. We called the body of the text of the get the Toref, right? Now, you might have thought that it's only if you put the Tanai in the text at the very end, that you might have thought that the only time the text invalidates the get is if the text appears at the end of the get. And then, therefore, if it's only done verbally, it's still legal as long as you take it back and give it back to her without the Tanai. And it's only invalid if the text is in the get. In other words, when I hired the sofer to write the get, I told him, write a get for my wife. And then I verbally said to her, this is your get, chutz mi ploni, right? Then we say, take it back and give it back to her and it's okay. But what if, you might have thought, says Rav Safra, what if when I hired the sofer and I hired the Edom to witness the writing of the get, I told all parties, realize that even though it's not going to appear in the text, I want the get to only be effective chutz mi ploni, except for ploni, that she's not going to marry ploni. In that situation, says Rav Safra, you might have thought that since there was foreknowledge on everyone's part, even the sofer who's writing the get, that the get should be done in a malformed fashion, you might think that even though the text is not there explicitly, but since everyone knows that it's implicit, you might think that that too would invalidate the get. So teaches Rav Safra, no. As long as that text is not in the get, even if it was understood at the outset that that was the husband's intention, it still will be a valid get as long as he does not verbalize the Tanai when he gives it to her in the final analysis. V'Rava Omar, lo shanu ela la'acher hatoref, avol lifnei hatoref alfilu al peh nami pasel. And Rava says, I disagree. I hold that it's only going to be a problem when it's done in the text of the get, if it's written at the very end of the get. But if it was explained, if it was explicated at the outset of the writing of the get, then even if it's only said verbally, he tells the sofer, write a get because I plan to divorce my wife and she'll be permitted to marry any man except for Ploni, and that's the understanding of everyone at the beginning of the writing of the get, then even if the text is not explicit, it will still be an invalid get and he can't use it. Be'az da Rava l'taimei, da amar lehu Rava lahano de kasvi giti, shisku shtuki lebal ad de kasvisu le latorif de gita. And Rava was consistent in the way that he presided over his own Beis Din, is that when he had a Beis Din where there was a get, he told everyone in the court, make sure the husband keeps his mouth shut and doesn't say a word. Because if he says, she better not marry that Ploni guy, right, once I divorce her, he could potentially invalidate the get. So don't let him talk until after the Toref, until after the body of the get is written. Tana Rabban. The Brisa now says, in a related issue, Kol hatanoim poslim beget divrei Rebbe, that all conditions invalidate the get. Now what Rebbe is specifically talking about, according to Rashi, is that when a man says, I will let you get remarried to anyone except for Ploni. And what Rebbe is saying is that if that text is written in the get, it will invalidate the get, and it's kol hatanoi, meaning it doesn't matter whether it's written chutz mi Ploni, in which case we said that's for sure invalid, or whether it's said al menas shelo tinasi leploni, on the condition that you don't marry Ploni, where we said that that is a valid get, but Rebbe says that too invalidates the get if it's written in the text of the get. Now, the Chachamim omrim kol sheposel al peh posel bichsav, v'chol she'eno posel al peh eno posel bichsav. And the Chachamim disagree, and they say no. If such a condition would invalidate the get when it's verbalized that way, so then it would invalidate the get when the text appears that way in the get. But if the verbalization does not invalidate the get, then by putting it in the text of the get, it also will not invalidate the get will still be kosher. So therefore, the Gemara speaks it out. Chutz sheposel al peh posel bichsav, al menas she'eno posel al peh eno posel bichsav. When the husband uses the terminology of except for Ploni, that invalidates the get, and therefore, if you put that in the text, that'll also invalidate the get. But if he puts in the text Almanas shaloti nasi l'ploni, on the condition that you don't marry Ploni, since that's a valid oral Tanai, it's also a valid written Tanai, and the get will still be valid. So Omer Rebbe Zera, in trying to explain the machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim, explains as follows. Machlokas lifnei hatoref. The machlokas is only when you put the text in before the body of the get. The Rebbe Savar Gazrinan Almanas Atu Chutz, the Rabbanan Sabri Lo Gazrinan Almanas Atu Chutz. That Rebbe holds that we invalidate the get even though you put in the words Almanas, which would normally be kosher, lest you come right the next time Chutz. Avol La'acher HaToref Divrei HaKol Kosher. But if you write Almanas after the body of the get, even Rebbe would agree that's a kosher get. Umasnisan de Katani Kosvo V'kimna Bachutz Aval Amanas Lo Pasil, and therefore when we look at our Mishnah, and our Mishnah had said that only if you write the words Chutz Mi Ploni is the get invalid, but if you write Almanas, the get is kosher. Ibo is Ema Lifnei HaTorah V'Rabbanan. So either our Mishnah goes according to the Chachamim because you wrote it before the body of the get, before the Torah, and therefore according to the Chachamim it's still kosher, but according to Rebbe it's pasul, and our Mishnah only goes according to the Rabbanan. The Iba is Ema La'acher HaTorah V'Divrei HaKol. Or you could also learn that the words Almanas are written at the end of the get, and even Rebbe would therefore say it's kosher. However, V'Rava Amar, Rava says, I disagree with you, Rebbe Zera. Machlokas La'acher HaTorah. The machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim is even if you wrote the words Almanas at the end of the get. The Rebbe Savar Gazrinan Atu Lifnei HaTorah, Rabbanan Savi Lo Gazrinan Atu Lifnei HaTorah. Rebbe says anytime you use the words Almanas in a get, it's puzzle, whether you put it before or whether you put it at the end. And even though you put it at the end and you used Almanas, we still will asser it lest you come to put Almanas in the beginning of the get and use the word Chutz the next time. And the Chachamim say no, we're not going to be gozer so vayt. If you put Almanas at the end of the get, it's going to be kosher. But everyone would agree that if you put Almanas at the beginning of the get, Almanas that you don't marry Ploni, Raizel GITTEN, then even the Chachamim will agree that it's possible, even though they hold that orally that's a valid Tanai, but by putting it at the beginning of the get in the text itself, it's going to be possible according to everyone. Umasnisan de Katani Kosva Vukim the Bachutz of Almanas Lo Pasil La'acher HaTorah V'Rabbanan. And therefore, when our Mishnah says that the only time the get is possible if you use the words chutz mi ploni, but if you use the words almanas, the get in the text, the get is still kosher, you have to say that our Mishnah is going according to the Chachamim, and it's written at the end of the get, and only there did the Chachamim say it's kosher. But this Mishnah does not go according to Rebbe, because according to Rebbe, anytime you use almanas, even at the end of the get is possible. Tani avua de Rebbe Abin kamei de Rebbe Zera, kosav get al tanai divrei hakol pasul. So a brisa was taught by avua de Rebbe Abin. Now he's quoting a brisa that he learned, and he says it in front of Rebbe Zera. And remember, Rebbe Zera is the one who introduces us to this machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim. And Rebbe Zera says that according to Rebbe, if you use the words almanas before the toref, it's going to be invalid. But this brisa says that if you write almanas tanai in a get, everyone will hold that the get is pasul. Now, divrei hakol pasul v'hamiflag pligi. Now, how can you tell me that if you write almanas, everyone holds it's pasul? Remember, according to Reb Zera, according to the Chachamim, even if you wrote it before the Torah, it's still kosher. So, ela ema ledivrei hakol kosher v'hechidami la'achar hatoref. So when Reb Zera heard this brisa, he says, "My dear friend, you're making an error in the text of the get, and therefore the error, the way you explain the error is that you're making an error in the brisa. Instead of saying that everyone agrees that the get is pasul, you must have learned that everyone agrees that the get is kosher. V'leima hareza pasul v'Rebbe." But the Gemara says, but wait a minute. Maybe the error in the brisa is not that everyone agrees that the get is kosher. Maybe what the brisa means, what the brisa, we know there's an error. But maybe the error is not to change the word pasul into kosher. Maybe the way to change the brisa is to say that instead of everyone holding that the get is pasul, only Rebbe holds that the get is pasul, and the Rabbanan would say that since you use the word almanas, the get is kosher. But the Gemara answers like this very simply. Tana divrei hakol asnaye. Kosher b'pasel michlaf lei. Harei zeh b'divrei hakol lo michlaf lei. The Gemara answers like this. Rabbi Zera knew that an error was made in the Brisa. It's one thing for a student to make an error to switch by accident to say pasel instead of kosher. That's a one-word mistake that is very easy to make. And therefore Rabbi Zera says that's probably the mistake that was made. But if you heard the Brisa that everyone agrees that ... then it's very difficult for us to say that you heard those words wrong. It's very illogical to suggest that instead of you having heard everyone agrees, you actually heard that only according to one opinion is it possible. So therefore, if we have to modify the Brisa, I'd rather say that the Brisa reads everyone holds it's kosher instead of saying that only Rebbe holds that it's possible. We'll hold it here for today.